Thanks so much to our one lucky guy, Geraldo Rivera, who has a phenomenal book coming out, another memoir called The Geraldo Show, which puts this incredible career into a different kind of perspective. So well done, Geraldo, and we will see you throughout the day. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it.
Tomorrow at noon Eastern, guess what returns? Outnumbered. And right now, here's the one and only Melissa Francis in for the one and only Harris Faulkner.
Fox News alert, could Vladimir Putin soon be visiting Washington? Let's go to Outnumbered Overtime. I'm Melissa Francis in today for Harris Faulkner. The Kremlin saying that President Trump has invited the Russian leader to the White House for a visit. A Putin aide telling reporters that during a phone conversation last month, the president, quote, suggested that the first meeting could be held in Washington between the two leaders. Word of this comes amid tense relations between the U.S. and Russia, both nations expelling each other's diplomats over the Kremlin's suspected nerve agent attack on a former spy in the U.K. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders saying, quote, as the president confirmed himself on March 20th, hours after his last call with President Putin, the two had discussed a bilateral meeting in the not-too-distant future at a number of potential venues, including the White House. We have nothing further to add at this time. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts joins us from the North Lawn, where it's already been a very active Monday, John.
Yeah, and not just because of the egg roll here either. Melissa, good afternoon to you. You know, White House officials have known about this for some time, but kept it under wraps. Word of this first broke out of the Kremlin today with the spokesman for Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, Yuri Ushakov, saying that President Trump, first raised the idea of a possible meeting here at the White House in that March 20th phone call that you referenced. The way that it was presented this morning, though, and the reason that it was presented this morning seemed to be wrapped around the expulsion, or at least the announced expulsion of some 60 Russian diplomats and intelligence operatives from the United States in retaliation for that nerve agent attack against the former Russian spy in the UK several weeks ago. The spokesman, Ushakov, saying, quote, against the backdrop of these events, it's difficult to discuss the possibility of holding this summit. So Russia sort of giving the back of their hand to the president over the expulsion of the diplomats. The president talked about the phone call and the idea that a meeting was going to happen soon when he was meeting March 20th with Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. The president said that he congratulated Putin on his election victory in that call, which prompted somebody at the White House to leak the contents of a pre-briefing memo, a pre-phone call briefing memo, which said, do not congratulate Putin. Somebody clearly trying to embarrass the president about that. The announcement by Russia today seemed more like political posturing than anything. Ushakov saying, quote, one day at one time or another, we can arrive at the start of a serious and constructive dialogue, and that a meeting between the two leaders, quote, would be rather important and beneficial for both countries as well as for the entire global community. I'm told by the White House there have been no preparations for a meeting just yet. The last time the president sat down with Vladimir Putin for any length of time was at the G20 summit in Hamburg last year. There are no conferences that will put the two presidents in the same city at the same time until November. So any meeting between the two of them would have to be a specially arranged bilateral. Likely that President Trump would not visit Russia, so the White House likely candidate for a meeting between the two leaders, though it could also be somewhere else. By the way, Melissa, the last time that Russian President Vladimir Putin sat down with an American president in the United States was in 2015. That was when President Obama and Putin got together at the UN. The last time he was here at the White House was way back in November of 2001 when he visited President Bush. He also went to the ranch in Crawford. So it has been now some 16 years since he's been here at the White House. So if he were to appear here for a meeting, it would be quite a momentous event. Melissa?
John Roberts, a lot to think about there. Thank you. For more on all of these developments, we are joined now by Democratic Congressman John Garamendi of California. He's a member of the House Armed Services Committee. Sir, thank you for joining us. Your thoughts on that potential meeting?
Oh, it's fraught with difficulty. You just think about what happened when President Kennedy met with Khrushchev, and when Kennedy was not prepared. That was in Vienna in the 60s, and it was a disaster for the United States. You got to be very, very careful about this. And let's keep in mind that Putin is no friend of the United States. His government is hacking into our vital infrastructure, our power grids, our power plants, our chemical plants, other things, putting at risk this nation, and to say nothing of what's going on in Syria.
So is it better to not sit down and talk with him then? I mean, isn't it better to open the lines of communication, if nothing else, than to look in his eyes and let him know that we're serious?
Well, I think somebody looked into Putin's and saw his heart. I think we need to be really, really careful here. This guy, Putin, is out to diminish the United States, diminish our allies around the world. The attack in the chemical attack in Great Britain is but one example. The hacking into America, the American electoral system, all of those things are all things that this Putin has done to the United States, to say nothing of Crimea and what's gone on in eastern Ukraine.
All that is true.
And so we got to be, but we need to be very, very clear what our goal is. It's not just to make nice. It's to make sure that Russia stops what it is doing to us and to our allies.
Isn't that more effectively communicated face-to-face between two leaders, though?
Well, it could be, but it could also be a disaster if you're not well prepared and you don't know exactly where this conversation is going to go. And that's why all of these meetings are preceded by very careful, thoughtful interaction at lower levels, so that there's no surprises. It could come out of this thing with a win, could just as easily come out of it with a major disaster, either a major giveaway of something that is extremely important to us and to our allies, or maybe a serious escalation of the confrontation. So what I'm saying is, take care, be careful here.
In the meantime, President Trump is taking to Twitter, declaring that a deal on the Dreamers is off the table. The president tweeting, DACA is dead because the Democrats didn't care or act. Now everyone wants to get onto the DACA bandwagon. It no longer works. Must build a wall and secure our borders with proper legislation. Democrats want no borders, hence drugs and crime, as more than 1,000 migrants from Central America are headed to the U.S. southern border, with some expected to seek asylum when they get here. Congressman, first of all, your thoughts on this caravan as we're looking at that video.
Yeah. Well, we have always, or at least in the last decade or so, we've had people trying to escape the violence and the political unrest in those Central American countries. We have a process in place that works pretty well of determining whether they are legitimately fearing for their lives, in which case there is a process. Now, keep in mind that President Trump ended one of those programs for Honduras and I believe also from Guatemala. So that program's not there. In all likelihood, these 1,500 people are going to be turned around and sent back where they came from. That's a rule.
Wait,
been a process.
Actually, that's not the way we understand the likelihood. Is that they'll be taken into the country and then they'll be given a date that they're supposed to show up in court and they're not going to come. That's what a lot of experts have predicted is going to happen with them. That they'll be let into the country and then sort of released in the community once they've been taken into custody. So I don't think they're going to necessarily be sent right back unless you know something different from what the experts have told us.
It's going to be dependent upon how they present themselves at the border. The rules and the processes are very, very clear. They've been in place for a long time. Yes, some of them will wind up in detention centers. Others might be released into the community. But all of them will have their day if they are seeking political or asylum for fear of their life. That's a process that is there. As I say, the president has already significantly reduced those programs for those Central American countries from which these folks are coming. So I'm not, and we're looking at about 1,500 people here. This is not an overwhelming invasion, and it's certainly not giving up the border. And by the way, there is no Democrat that I'm aware of in Congress, the Senate or the House, that is interested at all in an open border. We have put up money over the last decade. When the Democrats were in control, we voted in support of increased border security and border money, most recently in the omnibus bill.
Yeah, let me ask you about that before we run out of time. If there was a deal on the table that was a straight deal, these 1.6 or 1.8 million dreamers, amnesty basically, in exchange for $25 billion for the border wall, is that, if that was the straight deal that was set out there, is that something that you would sign and accept?
We've already said that we're willing to work along those lines. Senator Schumer actually put $25 billion on the table. Of course, I'm sure there were some details, like it's not a blank check. You can't go use that money for just anything you want. But clearly, we're interested in having border security, everything from drones to gates to fences, as well as detection machines that are used in border crossings to detect all kinds of material. We're very, very much in support of all that.
$25 billion isn't too much right now?
$25 billion is probably enough to be spent over the next 5 to 6 years as we go through very carefully determining what's most important. One thing you might want to consider is 200 tons of contraband were seized by the Coast Guard. 20 tons were seized at the ground border. So you might want to consider putting more money into the Coast Guard that actually has taken more than 10 times more contraband than at the border.
Sir, thank you for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. For more, let's bring in Fox News chief political anchor and the anchor of Special Report, Bret Baier. Bret, what do you think of what you just heard?
Hey, Melissa, on a number of fronts on the Russia meeting, I think it's interesting to hear that perspective. I do think that this president really wants to establish a relationship with the Russian president outside of all of the coverage of the Russia investigation, and that will make heads explode here in Washington. Clearly, Russia has been attacking the U.S. Clearly, they've been, hacking and try to get an effect in the election. But for someone to lift Putin up on a pedestal, he is playing a hand with not a lot of great cards. His economy is not fantastic. And if you, as a country, empowered Eastern Europe or the Baltic states with energy deals and you took them out of the equation with Russia, there could be leverage had by the U.S. You heard Senator Lindsey Graham over the weekend advising the administration to look back at Ronald Reagan and how he dealt with the Soviet Union and the threat from that. So I think that there is something afoot here. I don't know if this meeting at the White House is going to materialize.
You know, I've seen a lot of people already say, why would you let Vladimir Putin into the White House? Their technology, their snooping, they're so advanced. Don't we have better technology? I mean, can't we tell if we let someone into the White House if they, plant a listening device? That strikes me as a little bit ridiculous. Am I wrong?
Well, listen, if that's the case and they're worried about that, it's too late. I mean, they had the Russian ambassador and the foreign minister in the Oval Office at the beginning of this administration. And listen, that's always a concern, but it's nothing that the White House couldn't technologically overcome. I think that the bigger thing is just the atmospherics here.
Yeah.
And as John mentioned, 16 years since Putin has visited the White House. If that comes to pass, it will be a big, big moment.
They always say, the president's critics, when you come up to one of these meetings, whether we're talking about Vladimir Putin or we're talking about Kim Jong-un, they assume that he will not prepare and then he's going to walk in and say something off the cuff and the whole thing is going to be a disaster. Is that a fair criticism?
I mean, yes and no. This is a different kind of president who has a different kind of mentality about throwing the long ball, making a deal happen. The fact that North Korea is where it is and essentially is talking to China, talking to South Korea, and the prospects of this meeting seem like they're on track with President Trump, is largely, I think, fair to say that because of how President Trump has played this, Kim Jong-un is at the table. I mean, for administration after administration, it was the same deal with North Korea. This has changed the dynamic for good or bad.
Let me ask you before we run out of time, if you heard Congressman Garamendi coming just before you, and I asked him the straight question, what about this deal for amnesty for the Dreamers in exchange for $25 billion for the border wall? He seemed to say yes, that there was support for a straight deal like that. What do you think?
Well, I think there was. Then it kind of eroded. The administration stepped back with some other provisions that they needed to see happen on chain migration and other things. And then the deal fell completely apart. The president now puts it all on the Democrats. I think there's a mix here, but you're likely going to see the Democrats just want this as an issue heading into the election, and we'll see how that plays. Tonight, Melissa, we have the ambassador to Mexico, the Mexican ambassador to the U.S. Here on Special Report to talk about all of these issues, including that caravan you referenced with the congressman.
Well, I will be sure to watch that, Brett Baer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
China hitting back at President Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, what the retaliation could mean for our economy, and how the White House is reacting. Plus, former Secretary of Veterans Affairs David Shulkin pushing back on a White House statement that he resigned from his post. Why that matters. Former federal prosecutor Doug Burns is here to weigh in.
We've always had a very good relationship. Our discussions have been very focused on how we can do better, how we can do things in a better way to serve our veterans. So this was somewhat of a surprise.
Fox News alert, conflicting accounts on whether former Veterans Affairs Secretary David Shulkin was fired or resigned. It all started with Shulkin pushing back on a White House statement that he stepped down.
I came to the VA because our men and women in the country fight for us and don't give up. And I came to fight for our veterans, and I had no intention of giving up. There would be no reason for me to resign. I made a commitment. I took an oath.
Then, White House Director of Strategic Communications, Mercedes Schlapp, appeared to confirm this morning that Shulkin was ultimately fired.
General Kelly called Secretary Shulkin and gave him the opportunity to resign. Obviously, the key here is that the president has made a decision. He wanted a change in the Department of Veterans Affairs. He felt it was time.
Mike Emanuel is live in Washington with the details. Mike.
Melissa, nice to see you. Former VA Secretary David Shulkin says he was not expecting to be fired. Shulkin says after a phone call with President Trump, he had made plans to meet with the president before his time in the administration suddenly and abruptly came to an end.
We actually spoke the day that he sent the tweet out, just a few hours before. And we talked a lot about issues at VA that were important and how we could continue to make progress and policy issues. In fact, we had set up a meeting for the very next day where I was going to meet with him at 11 o'clock in the morning.
A vocal White House critic says he's worried the Trump administration will now push to privatize the VA, noting Shulkin resisted such efforts.
Now, I work very closely with the major veterans organizations, the American Legion, VFW, DAV, Vietnam Vets, all of the veterans organizations. And what they say is they want to strengthen the VA, not dismember it, not privatize it. So we will see what Dr. Jackson has to say.
Dr. Ronnie Jackson has been called a fine man and an honest public servant by those who knew him during the Obama administration. But some are questioning his ability to lead such a massive bureaucracy. A key Republican says Dr. Jackson is a solid choice.
Well, I think he'll get confirmed because he's made life and death decisions on the battlefield. He's commanded medical personnel on the battlefield. He's been in the middle of this war. And you need somebody to go into the VA who's willing to fight the bureaucracy. And I think Admiral Jackson's a good pick because he's been on the battlefield. He knows what the fight's all about.
Others note the VA has been a mess under a wide range of secretaries with varied backgrounds. So perhaps Dr. Jackson will be the right person to shake things up. Melissa?
They need something, that's for sure. Mike Emanuel, thank you. Joining me now for more on the legal implications of all this is former federal prosecutor Doug Burns. Let's start with Shulkin, whether he was fired or quit. What difference does it make?
Well, the reason it makes a difference is that there's a law from 1998, the Federal Vacancies Reform Act. It's a little in the weeds, but let me explain. And the text of the law addresses somebody who either resigns or can't fulfill the duties of their office. It's silent, apparently, on if somebody's fired. So the argument from those who oppose the president putting in the temporary replacement is you can't do that when somebody has been fired. I actually think it's a little weak legally because there's some legislative history, floor debate with senators indicating that they wanted to really include somebody who was fired. And then there's the obvious political backstory working off the way you guys teed this up, which is that the number 2 in the VA, in the agency, is similarly opposed to the president's approach, seriously, Melissa, with respect to the VA. So that's why he put in the temporary replacement.
So it's a fight between whether he can really put in a temporary replacement or if he's forced to elevate the number 2?
That's exactly what it is, because normally if somebody is out, the number 2 assumes the post. But the other political backstory, which is really interesting in my opinion, is here's the question. Is this a trial run, i.e., if he did want to get rid of the Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein would move up. He doesn't want that. So this is like a trial run to see if he could put in a temporary replacement.
Well, that's speculation.
Yeah, that's speculation, of course.
But it's still interesting to think about. There's also the idea, you know, of as, you know, some people in my household say this is a president who loves to fire people. He just loves to fire people. And that maybe it makes it harder to hire down the line. That's something that Senator Ron Johnson said. Listen.
It's not the way I do it.
You would understand if people were like, I don't know if I want to take this job.
I think the president does need to understand the effect it has on attracting other people.
So that makes logical sense. At the same time, the honor and even, you know, the ego that goes into if somebody calls you and asks you, if the president calls you and asks you to come and take any job, people really going to turn that down? You never think you're going to get fired when you take a job.
As crazy as it sounds, what you put forward is so interesting because, I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, so let's check that at the door. But, I mean, look, he was on this massive TV show, the essence of which was, you know, terminating and firing people.
Right.
You're fired. Many wiser than I've said, you know, this presidency takes on, you know, indications of reality television and so forth. So I think your observation is brilliant, to be honest with you.
Yep. But what does it mean going forward? I mean, does it truly mean that people are reluctant to take the job because they think they're going to get fired?
No,
I sort of think when he calls someone, their ego is, he's calling me, I'm wonderful, you know, I'm not going to get fired. You never think you're going to get fired, even if you're going into a job where the person before you was fired.
There are two aspects to this. One is just discussing it in a vacuum, and two, the reality, which is, oh my God, being in the Oval Office. Oh my God, there's the president. As people have said, it's the office, not the person, to some extent. So I think it's hard to turn down if the president comes knocking and says he wants you to serve in the administration. But at the same time, I don't think we've seen a level statistically of this many terminations.
So a lot of people have wondered why Shulkin is so, why he's talking so much, why he's out going around doing so many things, and you know, even sort of talking about the way in which he was released. Do you feel, I've wondered if there's another agenda there. Well, as a lawyer, do you feel like he's teeing up for something, or what is he doing?
Well, here's some more speculation, which I don't think is that outlandish. I mean, you look at Supreme Court litigation. They go around, they want to find a plaintiff, find a case. So maybe somebody enlisted him on this idea about, wait a minute, the president can't pick the interim person because they want to drive that agenda of what they want versus the president. It's kind of interesting.
That would be an interesting thing to look out for going forward if somebody picks him up to be the issue. Wow, good insight. Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right, the U.S. and South Korea kicking off annual joint military exercises after a delay for the Winter Olympics. How North Korea is responding and what it means to a possible meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. Plus, the Dow selling off today, in case you didn't notice. Look at that. 586 points right now as China hits back against President Trump's tariffs. Details ahead. The U.S. and South Korea resuming annual joint military exercises after a delay for the Winter Olympics. But the drills have been shortened to 1 month with no major U.S. strategic assets expected there. Also notably absent so far, North Korea's usual objections to the drills ahead of high-stakes negotiations with South Korea and the U.S. Senior Foreign Affairs correspondent Greg Palcott is live in London with the latest. Greg.
Hi, Melissa. Yeah, I think you've underscored it. There are some high-stakes negotiations upcoming, and that's why we're seeing a bit of a different take on these drills. They are still going on, however, while hefty hardware is deployed, and that includes the USS Wasp. That's an amphibious assault ship, along with its F-35 jet fighters on board, plus 11,000 U.S. troops, tens of thousands more on the South Korean side. Yes, aircraft carriers and bombers are not involved. The usual 2-month-long exercises have been cut down. The defensive nature of the maneuvers have been stressed, and we're showing archive video because so far there hasn't been any TV coverage allowed. In the words of one of my military contacts who are involved in the exercises, quote, "We want the diplomatic efforts to stay on track." Kim Jong-un has even said that he understands that the exercises have to go forward. Normally, he and his state media are usually blasting the drills at this time, calling them a rehearsal for war. Instead, over the weekend, Kim Jong-un was busy attending a concert of South Korean musicians and artists in Pyongyang, including, maybe especially, a K-pop girl band, a very popular one. He reportedly hand-picked this band. In his words, according to the North Korean leader, he was moved by the performances. Just recapping the diplomacy coming up, aside from all of that music, on April 27th, there'll be the Inter-Korean Summit. That's Kim Jong-un and his counterpart in South Korea, South Korean President Moon. There'll be another planning session for that later in this week. And in May, supposedly, yes, it's the big enchilada. President Trump and Kim Jong-un. We haven't yet heard, publicly at least, of any planning for that. Back to you.
All right. Greg Palcott, thank you. For more on all of this, let's bring in retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Michael Waltz. He is former Green Beret commander, also a counterterrorism advisor to former Vice President Cheney. Sir, thank you for joining us. What do you make of the little signals that have gone back and forth here so far?
Well, I'm glad that we are moving forward with these exercises. These are annual exercises, as Greg mentioned. They're quite large, 300,000 Korean troops, about 10,000 U.S. troops. And if you remember last year when these exercises went on, the North Koreans launched 4 medium-range ballistic missiles, including one over Japan. So on the one hand, it's good that these are moving forward. I'm also encouraged by the fact that the UN yesterday, under the leadership of Nikki Haley, passed additional sanctions over 15 companies and 27 ships that were evading previous sanctions. And 4 of those companies, I believe, were in the Chinese mainland to keep the pressure up on them. So the bottom line is we have to sustain this maximum pressure. We have to keep the foot on the North Korean economy. That is how you get meaningful results at the diplomatic table.
So a lot of people say the same thing, that we have to keep up this maximum pressure. But if we don't deploy a U.S. asset to the area during these war games, does it look like, or practices, whatever they are, I don't want to call them by the wrong name, but if we don't deploy a U.S. asset to the area, does that take some of the pressure off?
Well, I think I don't know that it necessarily takes the pressure off. If you remember before, one of the preconditions from the North Koreans is that we stop all exercises. So that's why I'm encouraged by the fact that we are moving forward, and yet he's still coming to the table. But it's the economic pressure on both the Chinese and the North Koreans that is really what bites, but it takes a little bit of time. Just, I have a healthy skepticism that the North Koreans aren't using yet another page out of their playbook to buy more time here, Melissa. John Bolton, I think, shares that skepticism. Actually, we know he does. But the important thing is that they don't, that we all keep in mind the North Korean missile engineers and their nuclear program is moving forward. They're busy little bees getting that ICBM fully operational while all of this is taking place. So time's of the essence.
One of the major criticisms that we've heard of the president in advance of this meeting, and even tied to a potential meeting with Vladimir Putin, and you might have heard it at the beginning of our show, is people saying that he's not going to prepare, that he's going to walk in and he could end up getting really hoodwinked at the table because he wouldn't have put in the time. Are you concerned about that, especially given that he does now have Ambassador Bolton at his side, someone we all know well, who is very sharp, very prepared, and very strong?
Look, I think the president has one of the best national security teams around him since Ronald Reagan. Pompeo, Mattis, now Bolton, but previously H.R. McMaster, who had done a lot of work to prepare for this. I am concerned somewhat on the State Department side. We need to get a named ambassador in place, and we need to get the rest of the State Department, in terms of Trump's political appointees, moved through the Senate and fulfilled. But I think he'll be fully prepared. This president is engaging at a very high level across a number of states here, whether it's Putin or Kim Jong-un or Xi. We've seen all of his trips, whether it was the Saudi trip, the Israeli trip, and the Chinese trip. I think we're quite successful.
What do you think he has to return with from this sit-down meeting in order for you to feel like it was a victory?
Well, he has to come back with a firm commitment for denuclearization, period. It does not have to be regime change. We've made that very clear. Kim Jong-un can stay in power, but he has to denuclearize. He needs to fully understand, straight from the president's mouth, if you achieve this capability, it will mean your destruction. Now, what I'm concerned about is then on the back end, the devil's in the details, and the North Koreans can buy a lot of time there. When inspectors can go in, what kind of notification, what sites they can inspect, and those negotiations they can drag on for months while they're completing their missile program, and that's why getting some of the key diplomats at the State Department in place who know how to play this game is so important.
All right. Sir, thank you for coming on. We appreciate your insight.
Okay, thanks so much.
China is hitting back after the Trump administration slapped tariffs on them, whether it could lead to a trade war and what that would mean for our economy.
The president wants free, fair, and reciprocal trade with China, but that hasn't been the U.S.-China trade relationship for the past several decades. So he took action under 232 to defend our aluminum and steel industries, which are essential to national security.
Fears of a trade war sending stocks plummeting, the Dow down more than 600 points. Look at that. As China slaps tariffs on more than 100 U.S. products in retaliation for tariffs that the Trump administration levied on steel and aluminum imports. The duties going into effect today apply to American products like frozen pork, wine, and certain fruits and nuts. As the White House is reportedly going to unveil more tariffs on China this week to punish Beijing over technology transfer policies. Here's White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders.
The president knows that we're billions of dollars in a trade deficit with China. He's tired of us being taken advantage of. They've taken our intellectual property, and the president's going to fight back, and he's going to push back. But we want to be able to work with them to make sure that we're getting a good deal.
Brian Brenberg is the chair of the program in business and finance at the King's College in Manhattan. Thanks so much for joining us. Yep. You know, for years I heard CEOs complain about the fact that they had their intellectual property stolen, that the deals were unfair, that the U.S. government really did nothing in order to protect them. But now that the president is stepping forward to do something, the market's upset because they realize the consumer could be hurt in the short term, right?
Look, I mean, this is the first president we've seen really go after this issue. But the problem is when you go after this issue, you have to go after one of the U.S.'s biggest trading partners, China. And there's no easy way to do it. If they're stealing intellectual property, you've got to hit back. He's threatening to do that. And now you see the responses. And yeah, CEOs are saying, ooh, the market's disrupted a little bit more. Yeah. But look, you've got to do this, something like this, if you're going to get some traction on this issue.
In terms of, I mean, you know business, you know finance, in terms of looking at it from that perspective, was there any other way to really open this negotiation, get it moving, other than slapping the tariff on and saying, come, here you go? You want to sit down and talk now?
Well, negotiations don't work unless you have a carrot and a stick. And obviously, you have to put that stick on the table and say, here's what we're going to do if you don't play ball with us. So I don't think there's any other way to do it besides that. The question is, how fast can you get the negotiation done? The skill of a negotiator isn't the first terms you put out there. It's how quickly you can get to your deal. That's the issue for markets right now. If the president can get to a deal quickly, it'll calm people down. It'll calm businesses down. We'll get back to enjoying these tax cuts. But it's all about the speed of the negotiation here.
It's about the speed of the negotiation for people out there who are buying goods. Right. But in terms of getting the deal done, having an exploding timeline, it screws up your negotiating style. I mean, you put time pressure on it, then it pressures him to not get the best deal.
Yeah, he can't put a timeline out there, but he has to get it done quickly because it's the uncertainty that's rattling everyone.
That's what we're seeing on Wall Street.
It's not the size of the tariff. We're only talking about $3 billion of trade on this tariff. That's a small number relative to what we export. The issue is how long will this go on and how many businesses and investors will sit out there saying, can I get my product? Can I sell my product? How is this going to affect me? You want to get that finished quickly so that people aren't thinking about the uncertainty. They're thinking about, who do I hire? How do I build my business? That's where we were just a few months ago. Yeah. That's what we want to get back to.
So you mentioned that it's not that big. And actually, some on Wall Street have said it's an interesting sign that the retaliation from China really wasn't very big. And it kind of indicates, if you look at the different signals, that both sides really do want to make a deal.
I think the signals are clear that both sides want a deal, especially with China. China could have gone after our biggest exports, soybeans, aerospace. They didn't. They kept it relatively small. There's a lot of tough talk, all sorts of tough talk, but don't pay attention to the talk. pay attention to what happens. On the U.S. side, same thing. Steel and aluminum tariffs, but we backed off on most of those countries. All the signals are there. Let's do a deal. Let's do it quickly. Now the question is, can they get there? And I expect they're going to, because really the president doesn't want to disrupt the momentum he has in this country. That's what he's selling in 2018.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to see people making decisions based on these tariffs over the long term if they're not going to be there, and then people are out of work at a time or prices go up, and it hurts the good economic vibes that have been coming as a result of the tax cut. There's probably more to it in this market, though. When we say something like the market's down 600 points because of these Chinese tariffs, there's more to it than that. Some of the other factors might be the idea that we've had a long run up, and there are people that take these opportunities to take a little money off the table.
You can take money off the table. You've got other issues like Amazon right now. That's a big story. That's definitely affecting markets. Facebook and the questions around data. When the tech sector suffers, the market's going to suffer, because that is the market these days. So trade is part of this, but there are bigger issues, and Amazon and Facebook really are at the forefront of that.
I'm glad you brought that up, because Facebook's problems look like something that isn't going to go away quickly.
No.
I mean, there is another layer, and you know when you see these negative stories about companies, sometimes they're off the front page and they're gone, and this just seems to take another leg down and another leg down and another leg down, and you think that could be big problems for the market, given how much Facebook is in everyone's lives.
Information is the currency nowadays, and it's clear that companies like Facebook don't know how to deal with it. That's a total reassessment of their key assets. That's going to linger for a long time. We have to figure out, what do we like about social media? What can we tolerate? What can't we tolerate? And until we have that cultural conversation, these issues are going to persist.
Real quick before you go, Facebook, is it a change in management? Is it a change in what their business model is? What do you think? I know I'm putting you on the spot because I didn't tell you we were going to talk about this. But
I think it's a change in this story about how they create value for people. And I think it's going to mean they're going to have to pull back from a lot of what they do with our data and find new sources of revenue. That's going to be really hard for them.
Okay, thank you for rolling with me on that. I surprised you with that question. Good job. All right, could too much enthusiasm actually hurt Democrats in the midterm elections? A new report says that's what Republicans are hoping for. So is that possible, or...
Hi, everyone. I'm Dana Perino. The market's on another wild ride as China escalates the trade war with the U.S. So how will this affect rural farming communities? We'll explain. Plus, teachers in multiple states walking out of the classroom right now over what they call unfair wages. We will have a live report. And just how much is Nancy Pelosi being used in House Republican midterm ads? And is it a winning strategy going forward? We're going to debate that on the Daily Briefing.
A new report that Republicans are looking to capitalize on crowded Democratic primaries before the midterm elections, hoping that brutal internal battles will end up hurting the party in November. But Democrats say that is wishful thinking, and they'd rather have too much energy heading into the midterms than too little. Let's bring in our power panel. Jeannie Zaino is a political science professor at Iona College, and Steve Lonigan is a former Ted Cruz presidential campaign director for New Jersey. Thanks to both of you for joining us.
Good to be here.
Jeannie, I'll start with you. On the Democratic side, I mean, you look at places like Houston, where you have an activist candidate, Laura Moser, I believe is how you say her name, and she has been battling it out with a more centrist candidate that Democrats feel would be better in a broader election, but could, if she ends up winning, still be damaged in the primary. It's kind of an age-old story. We're seeing it here in New York as well. Cynthia Nixon and Governor Cuomo really fighting it out. Does it hurt the eventual winner on the Democratic side?
There is always that danger, right? And it could be the Christine O'Donnell situation back in Delaware in 2010, when the primaries elect somebody so far to the left or the right that they really don't appeal in the middle and the party ends up losing. I don't see that in the offing for the Democrats this year. So if I have to say, and I know Steve will disagree with me, I think this is all wishful thinking about, is there a danger of too many candidates? Because you want enthusiasm, you want energy. Democrats have that. In 2010, that kind of energy, a 6-point enthusiasm gap, got Republicans 63 seats in the House. So if you had to choose, you'd want energy and enthusiasm. Too many candidates can be a problem, but it's much better to have too much than too little.
Steve?
I don't know if it's enthusiasm or the very far left wing of the Democrat Party being fully energized. I mean, down in Louisiana just a few days ago, Karen Peterson, the chairman chairman of the Louisiana Democrat Party called for the repeal of the Second Amendment. So what you see is the crazies in the Democrat Party, the real Bernie bros and the far left wingers pulling their party far to the left and pulling it away from the traditional labor union base of the Democrat Party. I think they have a big problem. Look, the more of it we see, the better. And I think this is not just about Nancy Pelosi. It's about George Soros. It's about the people who funded Antifa. It's about the Democrat Party careening to the left. I think that's what hurts them in November.
This is always what happens in the questioning afterwards when a party loses a big election, as they say, should we lurch further into our core beliefs or into the extreme of what our party represents, or should we try and be mainstream and be in the middle, and maybe that we could steal some from the other side? What do you think right now, Jeannie, is the formula for Democrats? Do you think it's more centrist or more activist?
For the House, it depends on the districts, and this is what we really have to keep in mind. This is a battle for the Democrat for 24 seats in the House. There are 25 seats in the House up now that Republicans hold, but that Hillary Clinton won those districts. And for that reason, you're going to see that there is a big chance that they could pick this up. And so I do think that you have to look at it as a district by district race, and there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solutions. Yeah. There are some states in which, as you mentioned, Cynthia Nixon, Governor Cuomo here in New York, in which moving to the left can really help the Democrats, and there's other districts in which it won't. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all solution when we're talking about the House.
You mentioned something before about the core beliefs of the Democrat Party, and that's what's being defined here. What are those core beliefs? Is it the far left wing of the party that wants to repeal the Second Amendment to the Constitution? Every congressional candidate in the Democrat Party now has to answer that question, because apparently the left wing of the Democrat Party
but let
is
me
calling
stop
for that
you,
repeal.
because it's the same thing on the right. I mean, they said the same thing down in Alabama, and every time you see a change in power or you see a lost election, is the Republican Party lurching far to the right, or is it trying to appeal to more people? I mean, it seems like, go ahead.
The Republican Party is the party of conservative principles. That's defined in its platform. No matter what congressional district in, they may move a little bit side, about what those conservative principles are, but we don't change the party platform based on the district.
Let me just say there are very few conservatives happy with what hasn't gone on in Washington when Republicans have owned the Congress and the White House.
Thanks to both of you. We'll be right back.